Hello everyone, we are Group 5 and we will be discussing Articles 1199, 1206, 1207, and 1208. There are six primary classifications of obligations under Book 4 of the Civil Code, namely pure and conditional obligations, obligations with a period, alternative and facultative obligations, joint and solidary obligations, divisible and indivisible obligations, and obligations with a penal clause. Today, we will be tackling the third classification, specifically the alternative obligations discussed in Section 3, Article 1199. Moreover, we have decided to include Article 1200 in this report for us to have a better understanding of the said obligation. According to Article 1199, an alternative obligation is an obligation where several prestations are due, but the performance of one is sufficient. Further, as per Article 1200, the debtor or obligor has the right to election or choice of what prestation one will perform. However, election may also be granted to the creditor or the obligee. And lastly, the loss of one of the things does not extinguish the obligation. Now, let us go over Articles 1199 and 1200. Article 1199 states that a person alternatively bound by different prestations shall completely perform one of them. The creditor cannot be compelled to receive part of one and part of the other undertaking. For example, D borrowed from C 10,000 pesos. It was agreed that D could comply with his obligation by giving C 10,000 pesos, a colored television set, or by painting the house of C. The delivery of the 10,000 pesos, the colored television set, or the painting of the house of C is sufficient to comply with the obligation. Performance must be complete. C cannot be compelled to accept, for instance, 5,000 pesos and half of the television set, thereby establishing a co-ownership between them, or 5,000 pesos and the painting of a part of his house. Article 1200 states that the right of choice belongs to the debtor unless it has been expressly granted to the creditor. The debtor shall have no right to choose those prestations which are impossible, unlawful, or which could not have been the object of the obligation. For example, D insured his house with R, an insurance company. It is agreed that, if the house is destroyed or damaged, R may either pay the damage or loss, or reinstate or rebuild the house. Since nothing is said in the contract as to who has the right of choice, it belongs to R as debtor. Next example, S binds himself to deliver item 1 or 2 to B on November 10 and to communicate his choice on or before November 5. If S delays in making his selection, B cannot exercise the right because it is not expressly granted to him, but judgment in the alternative cannot be defeated by S by refusing to make a choice. In such a case, the court can give the right of choice to B. However, there are limitations to the debtor's right of choice. First, the debtor cannot choose those prestations which are impossible, unlawful, or which could not have been the object of the obligation, as these are void. However, their presence do not invalidate the obligation if it includes other undertakings otherwise free from such defects. For example, Kiko is bound to give Bon a pack of illegal drugs, a bottle of juice taken from tropical fruits harvested in Antarctica, a particular cigarette case, or a particular fountain pen. Kiko cannot choose the first, as it is unlawful, nor the second, because it is impossible. Kiko can therefore choose only between the third or fourth item. The next limitation is that the debtor has no more right of choice when among the prestations whereby he is alternatively bound, only one is practicable. In this case, There's not only a limitation but a loss of the right of choice belonging to the debtor as the obligation becomes simple. If in the previous example, the only possible prestation is for Kiko to give Bon a particular fountain pen, the obligation becomes simple. Hence, Kiko is obliged to give Bon the said pen. Lastly, the debtor cannot choose a part of one prestation and part of another prestation, which was already discussed in Article 1199. This concludes Article 1199 of Section 3. Thank you.
Good day everyone, my name is Joanna Laika P. Ramos and I'm going to discuss facultative obligation. So what is facultative obligation? A facultative obligation is one where only one prestation has been agreed upon but the obligor may render another in substitution. So, ibig sabihin, ang facultative obligation ay meron lamang isang payment or agreement na kailangan i-fulfill ni obligor. However, the obligor has the power to provide or give another in substitution. So, moving on, the Article 1206 says that when only one prestation has been agreed upon, but the obligor may render another in substitution, the obligation is called facultative. The loss or deterioration of the thing intended as a substitute through the negligence of the obligor does not render him liable. But once the substitution has been made, the obligor is liable for the loss of the substitution on account of his delay, negligence, or fraud. So as we can see, the Article 1206 contains two paragraphs. The first paragraphs on this article only define what facultative is. As I said earlier, ang facultative has only one prestation and that one prestation or payment is what we call principal things on the other hand, when the obligor used to present different things or payment, is it what we call substitution. For example, I will give you my piano, but I may give my LCS television set as a substitute. From this example, the due prestation is the piano. In other words, the piano is the principal thing. But instead of giving my piano, I will give you my LCS television set as a substitute. Another example is, letter D is obliged to give a specific ring to C with the agreement that D may deliver a specific watch as a substitute. In this case, the principal thing is the specific ring, and the substitute for the specific ring is the specific watch. So basically, that is the meaning of the first paragraph. Now let us understand the meaning of the second paragraph of this article. It says that the loss or deterioration of that thing intended as substitute through the negligence of the obligor does not render him liable. So, ibig sabihin, pag ang substitute ay nasira o kaya naman nagkaroon ng impairment before the substitution made, hindi liable si obligor. However, the Article 1206 also says, but once the substitute has been made, the obligor is liable for the loss of the substitution on account of his delay, negligence, or fraud. This sentence simply means na once nagkasundo ang dalawang panig or substitution at nagkaroon ng aberya dito, ang obligor o mas kilala natin bilang borrower ay liable na dito. Ibig sabihin may pananagutan na si obligor sa kanyang kapabayaan or panloloko. For example, Katerina promised that she will deliver a Canon scanner and printer to Daniela because she cannot give him an HP printer with scanner. Ang principal thing dito ay ang HP printer with scanner. Pero dahil hindi nga ito mabibigay ni Katerina, ang substitution o ang kapalit ng HP printer with scanner ay yung Canon scanner or printer. And take note that from our example, Katerina promised So technically, the substitution has been communicated. At kung hindi na-deliver ni Caterina yung Canon scanner and printer as what she promised dito, na dito na pumapasok yung ibig sabihin ng second paragraph ng Article 1206 na may pananagutan na si Caterina sa kanyang kapabayaan or panloloko.
Hello everyone, my name is Maria Eloisa Moral. I'm reporting for Group 5 and my topic is effect of loss and facultative obligation. So, rules in case of loss of principal thing and substitute. There are two scenarios in case of loss of principal thing and substitute. So, number 1 is before substitution and number 2 is after substitution. So, let's proceed to before substitutions first. Before substitution means before the debtor has informed the creditor of substitution. So, take note, dito sa facultative obligation, the right of choice belongs to debtor para mamili ng prestation. Before substitution, if the principal thing is through a fortuitous event, the obligation is extinguished. Example, Grisha will give Ryan a car, or Grisha wants a laptop. The car is lost during the fortuitous event, the obligation of Grisha is extinguished. Article 1174. So, yun nga po, sabi po dito, due to purchases event, wala nang obligasyon sa debtor na ibigay ang specific thing kay creditor. So, ano nga ba ang specific thing na sinasabi? Na sinasabing nawala, yun ay ang car. So, otherwise, the debtor is liable for damages. If the principal thing is lost, dahil sa kapabayaan ni debtor, dahil dyan, magbabayad siya ng damages kay creditor. So, yun nga po. So, ano nga ba ang magiging effect ng substitute and loss? Take note that the substitute is not due kasi this is before substitution. Bago inform ni debtor kay creditor yung substitution, so ang due lang ay yung principal thing or yung specific car sa ating example. So, whatever the substitute is lost through the fault of the debtor, kailangan pang ibigay ni debtor yung principal thing. At kung mapapansin nyo, hindi affected ang principal thing dito. So, however, the obligation ceases to be a facultative obligation and becomes simple obligation to deliver the principal thing, meaning to say, before the substitution, if the substitute is lost, hindi na siya magiging facultative. Hindi na siya magiging facultative obligation, magiging simple obligation na siya. Kasi, there is only one presentation, and that is the giving of the principal thing. So, pag sinabing simple obligation, ito yung obligation where there is only one prestation. So, yun nga po. Rules in case of loss of principal thing and substitute. After substitution, the debtor has informed the creditor to give substitute. After substitution, if the principal thing is lost, the debtor is not liable whatever may be the cause of the loss because it is no longer due. Example, based on the preceding example, if the car is lost or without the fault of Grisha is not liable for its loss since her obligation is to deliver a laptop. Na-inform na kasi ni debtor kay creditor na magbibigay siya ng substitute. That's why, ang due na ay ang substitute, hindi na yung principal thing. So, kahit wala yung principal thing, through the fault of debtor, kailangan pa rin ibigay ni debtor yung substitute. So, after substitution, dito tayo sa after substitution. Once the substitution is made, the obligation is converted into a simple one to deliver or to perform a substituted thing or presentation. The substitution becomes effective from the time it has been communicated. Article 12.01. Example. Sabi po dito tayo sa ating example. Based on the preceding example, if item 2 is lost through fortuitous event, obligation of Prisha extinguish, and item number 2 is lost through the fault of damages is liable. So, if the principal thing is lost after substitution, hindi na magiging facultative yung obligation, but rather than simple obligation, kasi there is only one prestation, and that is the giving of the substitute. So, yun nga po nasabi sa example. In the example, if the substitute is lost through a fortuitous event, the obligation is extinguished. Meaning to say, wala nang obligation si debtor na ibibigay, and yung substitute, however, the substitute is lost because of the fault of debtor, the debtor shall pay the damages. So, that is all. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Reynalyn A. Ramos, and I'm going to discuss the alternative and facultative obligation distinguished. First, I discuss what is the difference of alternative and facultative obligation. Alternative obligation, where a person engaged to do or to give several things, the payment of one will acquit him at all. Several prestations are due, but the performance of one is sufficient to distinguish the debt. If there are void prestations, the others may still be valid. If all prestations are impossible except one, that which is possible must still be given. Facultative obligation, where one thing is due but another is paid in its place, only one prestation, the principal obligation is due. The right of choice belongs to the debtor only. If the principal obligation is void, the debtor is not required to give the substitute. Number of prestation. Alternative obligation is a several prestation are due but compliance with one insufficient. Doesn't mean maraming prestation. Facultative obligation is only one prestation is due, older debtor is allowed to substitute it. Ibig sabihin, isa lang yung prestation. Right of choice. Alternative obligation is the right of choice may be given to the creditor or third person. Doesn't mean pwedeng pumili yung creditors. Facultative obligation is the right to make the substitution is given only to the debtor. Ibig sabihin, hindi pwedeng pumili. Letter lang talaga yung may right of choice.
Good day everyone, this is Marina Narvaez. Aside from number of prestation and right of choice, we can also distinguish alternative obligations and facultative obligations by loss through a fortuitous event and loss through the fault of debtor. In alternative obligations, the loss of one or more of the alternatives through a fortuitous event does not extinguish the obligation. Since in Article 1199 states that alternative obligations has several prestations. Example, Richard is to give Marielle a specific ring, a specific necklace, or a specific bracelet. Richard is the debtor and Marielle is the creditor. If the ring is lost due to a flood, Richard does not extinguish his obligation because he can still fulfill his obligation to Marielle to give the specific necklace or the specific bracelet. Unless if all the prestations are lost due to a flood, the obligation of Richard will already extinguish. While in facultative obligations, the loss of the thing do extinguish the obligation. Back to our example, Richard is to give Marielle a specific ring. If the ring is lost due to a flood, Richard will already extinguish his obligations because, as it is stated in Article 1174, no person shall be responsible for fulfilling the obligations due to a fortuitous event. Let us proceed to loss through the fault of debtor. In alternative obligations, the loss of one of the alternatives through the fault of debtor does not make him liable. As I have said in Article 1199 in alternative obligations, there are several prestations. So, if Richard lost the specific ring through his fault, he can still give the specific necklace. But, if it is in creditor's right of choice, if Marielle choose the specific ring, and if the ring was lost through the fault of Richard, then Richard will be liable in his obligation. The value of the ring plus damages will be given to Marielle. While in facultative obligations, before substitution, the loss of the substitute through the fault of debtor does not render him liable, because it is stated in Article 1201, the substitution becomes effective from the time it has been communicated. If Richard and Marielle has still no agreement, then Richard does not render liable. But if it is after substitution, the loss of the thing due through the fault of debtor makes him liable. As it is stated in Article 1170, those who, in the performance of their obligations, are guilty of fraud or negligence are liable for damages. I hope you have understand the difference of alternative obligations and facultative obligations by number of prestations, right of choice, loss through a fortuitous event, and loss through the fault of debtor. That's all. Thank you.
Hello, good day everyone. So this is Sarah Arya and I'm about to discuss Section 4, the joint and solidary obligations. And of course, the Article 1207 to Article 1208, it talks about the joint and solidary obligations. But for us to understand more of this topic, we must first understand the difference between joint and solidary. So next slide. So, as we can see, unahin po natin si joint. Sabi ko kanina, nabanggit ko na para maintindihan po natin yung Article 1207 to 1208, we must first understand the difference between joint and solidary. So, sa joint po, unahin natin siya. Ito pong joint obligation ay to each his own. So, ibig sabihin po nito, tandaan natin palagi na itong joint obligation, ito po ay to each his own. Ang joint obligation, kung ano lang yung share, kung ano lang yung part or what we called portion, yun lang po yung obligation niya. While the solidary, ito po ay one for all for one sila. Simple as that. Okay, so let's proceed na po sa Article 1207. So, as we can see po sa screen, sabi dyan, the concurrence of two or more creditors or of two or more debtors in one of the same obligation does not imply. So, let's take note that, na sabi dyan, the same obligation does not imply that each one of the former has right to demand. Sabi dyan, each one of the former has right to demand. Meron daw pong right to demand. Or that each one of the latter is bound to render. bound to render. Let's take note. Okay, so entire compliance with the prestation. So, of course, meron pa dyang kasunod na phrase pero hindi ko na siya sinama sa screen kasi masyado na pong mahaba. But sabi dyan sa Article 1207 ng katuloy po is, there is solidary liability only when the obligation expressly so states. So, sabi dito, magkakaroon lang siya ng solidary liability only, sabi, when the obligation expressly so states. Or magkakaroon lang din siya ng solidary liability when the law or the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. So parang optional lang siya. Ibig sabihin, kung i-require nila na magkaroon po ng solidarity, tsaka palang magkakaroon ng solidary liability. Okay, malinaw po. So next slide po tayo. In Article 1208 naman, sabi dito, if from the law or the nature or the wording of the obligations to which of the preceding article refers to the contrary does not appear, the credit or debt shall be presumed to be divided into as many equal shares as there are creditors or debtors. The creditors or the debts being considered distinct. So yung credits daw po or yung debts ay sila po ay kino-considered as distinct from one another. And sabi dyan, ito po yung pinaka-last phrase, sabi dyan, subject to the rules of court governing the multiplicity of suits. So, yung isang, ito po ang ibig sabihin niya ng Article 1208, ganito lang yan. So, ang isang creditor ay magpa-file po siya ng action against one debtor for its share or obligations, but in a view of this last phrase na binanggit ko, sabi dyan, subject to the rules of court governing the multiplicity of suits. So, dito naman ay, dahil dito, ay to obtain just or yung equality, ano po, yung pagiging equal sa lahat. So much better mag-file na rin siya ng action against all parties. Okay, I repeat again. Yung isang creditor ay magfa-file siya ng action against one debtor for its share or obligations, but in view of this last phrase, what I've already said, dahil dito, to obtain just, so much better magfa-file na rin po siya ng action against all parties. So, simple as that. Yan lang po ang ibig sabihin ng Article 1208. And nabanggit ko na rin, na-explain ko na rin po yung Article 1207. And I hope meron po tayong naintindihan from the Section 4 Joint and Solidary Obligations. Again po, this is Sarah Oria for the Joint and Solidary Obligations, the Article 1207 to 1208.
Hello, my name is Zarina Meidi Pulido, your reporter for the topic of kinds of obligations according to the number of parties, meaning of joint and solidary obligations. Okay, let's begin. Kinds of obligations according to the number of parties. We have individual obligation. 1. Where there is only one obligor or obliged. 2. Collective obligation. 1 where there are 2 or more debtors and or 2 or more creditors. It may be joint or solidary. Meaning of joint and solidary obligations. Joint and solidary obligation, there is a concurrence of 2 or more debtors and or creditors in one and the same obligations. Meaning to say, kapag dalawa o higit pa yung debtor and in the same time dalawa o higit pa yung creditor, automatic, it is either joint obligation or solidary obligations. Kung halimbawa naman, iisa lang ang debtor at isa lang ang creditor, hindi siya pwede tawaging joint obligation or even a solidary obligation. Now, let's discuss the joint obligation and solidary obligation separately. Joint obligation, or one where the whole obligation is to be paid or fulfilled proportionately by the different debtors, and or is to be demanded proportionately by the different creditors. Dito, kailangan nating i-take note yung proportionately. In a joint obligation, each debtor is liable only to a proportionate part of the debt, and each creditor is entitled only to a proportionate part of the credit. Pag sinabi nating debt, ito yung utang. At pag sinabi naman nating credit, is pautang. So, sa joint obligation, ang bawat debtor liable lang sa kanyang proportionate part doon sa utang. Hindi siya liable na bayaran yung buong debt. Yung proportionate part lang niya doon sa utang ang babayaran niya. On the other hand, ang bawat creditor naman entitled lang siya sa proportionate part nung pautang. Hindi siya entitled na i-collect lahat yung buong pautang. Yung proportionate part lang niya ang pwede niyang kolektahin. So, let me give you an example of joint obligation. So, here, let me give you an example of joint obligation. Number 1, ang ating mga debtors ay sina L, A, and W na nakahiram ng 12,000 pesos from B na ating creditor. Dito, makikita natin na si L is liable only for 4,000 pesos, A is liable only for 4,000 pesos, and W is also liable only for 4,000 pesos, ang proportionate part ng bawat isa sa kanila. As you can see, si L ay hindi siya liable na bayaran yung buong utang. Ganon din si A at W. Hindi rin sila liable na bayaran yung buong utang. So, each of them shall pay only their proportionate part of the debt, since 12,000 pesos yung utang at tatlo yung debtors, i-divide yung 12,000 pesos sa tatlo. So, 4,000 pesos ang proportionate part ng bawat isa. Sa number 2 naman natin is isa lang ang ating debtor, which is A, at dalawa ang ating creditors, which is B and C. Dito, kahit dalawa ang ating creditors, B can collect only 3,000 pesos and C can collect only 3,000 pesos. Ang pwede lang nila i-collect ay ang proportionate part nila ng pautang. Since 6,000 pesos yung pautang at dalawa yung creditors, i-divide yung 6,000 pesos ng dalawa. 3,000 pesos ang proportionate part ng bawat isa. Solidary obligation, or one where each of the debtors is bound render, and or each of the creditors has a right to demand from any of the debtors entirely compliance with the prestation. Dito na natin makikita yung difference between joint obligation and solidary obligation. Kasi sa solidary obligation, ang bawat debtor ay liable na bayaran yung buong utang. Kapag binayaran ng isang debtor yung buong utang, pwede niyang i-collect from the other debtor yung sobra niyang nabayaran. Ang bawat creditor naman ay pwedeng mag-collect ng buong pautang. Kapag na-collect niya ang buong pautang, ibibigay niya yung share ng other creditors doon sa pautang. So ngayon, meron din tayong example for solidary obligation. Ang solidary debtors natin is sina L, A, and W na nakahiram ng 12,000 from B. Ang kaibahan ng solidary obligation natin sa joint obligation, ang ating mga solidary debtors na si L, A, and W can entirely liable to pay the 12,000 pesos na nahiram nila kay B. Unlike kagaya kanina sa joint obligation, each debtors can 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 liable only to pay the proportionate part nila sa utang. At ganon din naman kapag ang creditors natin is dalawa at isa lang ang ating debtors, pwedeng i-collect ni creditor 1 yung kabuuang bayad ng pautang at kapag na-collect niya yung kabuuang utang, pwedeng siya na yung mag-abot ng share ni creditor 2 mula sa pautang. So, yun po ang aking topic. Next reporter po. Thank you.
Hello po, good morning. I'm Angelica Mendones and I will be reporting about the collective obligations. A collective obligation is presumed to be joint if number 1, if A is liable to B for 9,000, there can be no problem regarding the determination of the following. The person liable to pay, the person entitled to demand payment, the extent of the liability of the debtor, and the extent of the right of the creditor. Kung isa lang po yung may utang or yung debtor at isa lang din po yung creditor, is mas madali pong i-determine kung sino po yung magbabayad, sino lang po yung may utang. Sa second situation po natin is where there is a plurality of parties, 2 or more debtor or 2 or more creditors, and the share of each obligation is specified, the correlative rights and obligations of the parties are known. Sample po dito is yung if A, B, and C are liable to D in the amount of 9,000 pesos and it is stated that the corresponding share of each debtor is 3,000, alam po natin na si A, si B, at si C ay may utang po kay D, which is tagti 3,000 po sila. Alam po ni D na dapat si A is 3,000 po yung babayaran niya, si B 3,000 din po, and si C ganun din po. At hindi po pwedeng maningil si D kay A or kay B or kay C ng more than 3,000 po. Number 3 po is, on the other hand, let us suppose that if the same obligations, the share of each debtor is not specified. What is the extent of the liability of A, B, and C? In such case, the presumption is the obligation is joint, Article 1207 to 1208, and as consequence, there are as many debts as there are debtors. There are as many credits as there are creditors. The debts and the credits are considered distinct and separate from one another. Each debtor is liable only for a proportionate part of the debt, and each creditor is entitled only to proportionate part of the credit. The presumption is established is Article 1208 is however reputable. Sample po dito is, number 1 case po is A, B, and C borrowed 9,000 from D. The presumption is that A, B, and C are jointly liable. There are 3 debts and 1 credit. Meron po 3 tayong debtors pero sa iisa lang po sila nangutang. Second po is si A, umutang po siya kay B, C, D, amounting to 9,000 pesos po. Si A po is umutang po siya ng 9,000 pesos sa 3 creditor. Kay B, 3,000, kay C, 3,000, and D, 3,000 po. Ngayon po, yung si creditor po, si B, C, and D, ang obligasyon lang po ni A sa kanila is 3,000 pesos po. And the last example po is A and B are liable to C and D for 9,000 pesos. Di bali, dalawa po yung debtor, dalawa din po yung creditor. 9,000 pa rin po yung utang, tig 4,500 po si A tsaka si B. Yun na po ang babayaran nila kay C at saka si T. At hindi po pwedeng mag-exceed po ng 4,500 ang sisingilin po ni C and D kay A tsaka kay B. Dapat po exact amount lang po, 9,000 pa din po in total. Thank you, yun lang po.
Good day to everyone. For today's video, I will discuss the presumption subject to rules on no multiplicity of suit. The presumption in Article 1208 is made subject to the rules of court governing the multiplicity of suit. Otherwise, situation may arise where there are as many suit as there are debtors and creditors. So, ibig sabihin, this presumption in Article 1208 is one of the rules of court na magiging aware ang creditors and debtors na pwede silang mag-legal action, may pwede silang gawin para ma-resolve ang kanilang disagreement. So, ano nga po ba ang creditors and debtors? So, creditors, ito po yung mga nagpautang. So, the debtors, ito po yung umutang. So, next. The rules on multiplicity of suit to prevent the filing of two or more suit or complaints for a single cause of action or the same violation of the legal right of the plaintiff. So, ibig kong sabihin, kumbaga, may limit pala itong rules na to. Hanggat maaari daw po is iniiwasan mag-file ng ganitong action ng two or more suit kung ang kino-complaints lang naman is the same violation. So, pwede ka ulit mag-file ng ganitong suit if magkaiba naman magkaibang tao naman, magkaibang organization or parties naman ang inyong irereklamo. So, next. Word used to indicate joint liability. So, meron po tayong mga word na kung saan meron tayong mga adjective word na ginagamit for joint obligation. So, una po is the mancomunada. So, next is the mancomunadamente. Pro rata and proportionately, na kung saan ang ibig pong sabihin ay we promise to pay. So, ibig sabihin, sa meaning pa lang na we promise to pay, ibig sabihin, ito siguro yung kalalabasan ng kanilang suit or ginawang legal action. Syempre naman, para ma-resolve yung kanilang disagreement. Yun lang po. Thank you.
When obligation solidary. Solidary liability is not lightly inferred. Under Article 1207, there is solidary liability only when Article 1207, the concurrence of two or more creditors or of two or more debtors in one at the same obligation does not imply that each one of the former has a right to demand, or that each one of the latter is bound to render entire compliance with the prestation. There is a solidary liability only when the obligation expressly so states, or when the law of the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. Solidary liability also exists when it is imposed in a final judgment against several defendants. Words used to indicate solidary liability. Not all the times can use the word solidary until the obligations considered. It is sufficient that the obligation declares, for example, that each of the debtors will be forced to pay their full obligation, or can be pursued against the full of the value of their obligation, or can also have an agreement on when to pay. Example of other words used to indicate solidarity: jointly and or severally, solidaria in solidium, together and or separately, individually and or collectively, Juntos o separadamente, it's called I promise to pay or signed by two or more persons, which means that there is proof, especially in the payment of the negotiated obligation. Thank you.
Kinds of solidarity. They are passive solidarity, active solidarity, and mixed solidarity. Passive solidarity. Solidarity on the part of the debtors, where any one of them can be made liable for the fulfillment of the entire obligation. Yung example ng passive solidarity ay isa sa ilang may mga utang ay maaaring managot para sa pagbabayad o pagganap ng buong obligasyon. Then lipat naman tayo sa active solidarity. Solidarity on the part of the creditors, where any one of them can demand the fulfillment of the entire obligation. So, yung active solidarity daw ay isang alokasyon na kumukumpleto sa mga paunang mapagkukunan ng sambahayan upang maabot ang antas ng isang guaranteed income. Then, lipat naman tayo sa mixed solidarity on the part of the debtors and creditors, where each one of the debtors is liable to render and each one of the creditors has a right to demand enter compliance with the obligation. Then, so yung mixed solidarity naman daw ay pagkakaisa ng creditors at debtors. So, yun nga yung active solidarity tapos passive solidarity. Doon na tayo sa ng creditors at debtors, kung saan ang bawat isa sa creditors ay mananagot na ibigay ang bawat isa sa mga mapag-uutangan ng mga karapatang humihiling ng buong pagsunod sa obligasyon.
This is the continue of kinds of solidarity. Conventional solidarity is agreed upon by the parties in Article 1306. Kung walang na-mention by the contract that relating to the solidarity, the obligation is only joint. Legal solidarity is solidarity imposed by the law. And once people are in contract with legal system and they cannot just walk away, once has been arrested or detained by the police on the street. And legal solidarity is very useful until the end. In Article 1915, if two or more persons have appointed an agent for a common transaction, they shall be a liable solidarity. In Article 1945, two or more bills to whom a thing is loaned in the same contract, they are liable. Real solidarity. Solidarity imposed by the nature of the obligation. What is compensation law? Compensation law, or Article 4119, it is the protection of people who become injured or disabled while they're working at their jobs. Cabot system is awarded of exemplary damages, and it is a violation of law.
Good day. I'm Jefferson Ragudos and will be discussing to you the solidarity not presumed under joint solidarity obligations, or subtopic was solidarity not presumed. Okay, so solidarity not presumed, sinasabi rito, it is a presumption where there are two or more persons in the obligation is not a point. So, ano ba to? Sabi niya, ito ay isang pagpapalagay kung saan mayroong dalawa o higit pang mga tao sa obligasyon ay isang pinagsama. Ang dahilan ay napakabigat ng mga obligasyong magkakaisa dahil lumilika ito ng mga hindi pangkaraniwang karapatan at pananagutan. Ang pagkakaisa sa pagitan ng mga may utang ay nagdaragdag sa kanilang responsibilidad, habang ang pagkakaisa sa pagitan ng mga nagpapautang ay nagdaragdag sa karapatan ng bawat pinagkakautangan. Ang batas ay may posibilidad na paboran ang may mga utang sa pagkakalang sila ay nakatali ng sama-sama at hindi nag-iisa. In general, o sa pangkalahatan, ang pagkakaisa ng isang obligasyon ay hindi kailanman pinapalagay. Dapat itong hayagang ipahayag bilang tunay na layunin ng kalooban ng mga partido. Ang mga obligasyon sa pagkakaisa sa kontrata ay madalas nililikha ng mga patakaran o siguro sa pag-cosign sa isang pautang. Ang karaniwang halimbawa ng isang solidaryong obligasyon na nilikha ng masusing pagpapatakbo ng batas ay vicarious liability, gaya ng respondent superior o yung tinatawag na the master-servant rule, kung saan ito ay isang doktrina na ang isang partido ay may pananagutan sa mga aksyon ng kanilang mga ahente. Halimbawa, may mga pagkakataon na kung kailan managot ang isang tagapag-empleyo para sa magawa ng empleyado na ginawa sa loob ng kurso ng kanilang trabaho. Halimbawa, ikaw yung supervisor, tapos yung empleyado mo may lapses o pagkakamali. Siyempre, ang balik nun, hindi lang naman sa empleyado mo, kundi pati sa iyo na superior. So, siyang magandang halimbawa rin dito, yung mga kumukuha ng mga hulugan ng motor dyan sa motor trade dyan sa atin. Pero di ba, isa sa requirements nila, kailangan may co-maker. So, nangyayari dyan, halimbawa, si personal na nangutang, hindi nagbayad, ang hinahabol ni motor trade, si co-maker, kasi nga, nakapirma siya ron sa contract as co-maker. Solidarity can be either active or passive. O ito raw solidarity nito, pwedeng maging aktibo o active or passive. Ang isang solidaryong obligasyon na aktibo ay umiiral sa mga obligees, mga nagpapautang sa transaksyon. Ito ay passive kapag ito ay umiiral sa mga obligor, may utang sa isang transaksyon. Ang isang solidaryong obligasyon ay halos palaging isang kalamangan para sa isang pinagkakautangan dahil ito ay maaaring magpahintulot sa sino mang nagpapautang na hingi ng kabuuan ng utang mula sa nag-iisang may utang kapag ang pagkakaisa ay aktibo, o ito ay nagpapahintulot sa pinagkakautangan na hingi ng kabuuan utang mula sa alinmang marami ang may utang kapag ito ay passive. O gaya nga nung sinabi ko sa inyo kanina, yung pagko-co-maker, no, nagiging yung sa atin tumulong para labas ng motor yung kaibigan o kamag-anak, pero yung obligasyon nito medyo mabigat din kasi pagka si principal na nangutang nga hindi nagbayad o tinakas yung motor, ikaw na co-maker, ikaw ngayon yung habulin ng ahensya o motor trade na gaya ng example ko kanina. So ganun lang classmate, salamat sa inyong pakikinig. Muli, Jefferson Ragudos, reporting solidarity not presumed. Thank you.